the building stood alone, a solitary construction among dried grass and brown dirt. It seemed to only still be standing due to the robust red brick skeleton protecting it from its exposed position in the sun and terrible winds.
When I think about the idea that sparked the novel, more than some of the reasons I talked about before in the last recording, I think back to 2014 actually. Back in 2014, I went to South Korea for the first time as part of my job when I was in the military, and it was an interesting trip because nobody usually, when you're in the military, just to give you some context, when people go to Korea, they get all these briefings and they get all these, warnings and stuff, and I didn't get that. My boss told me to go, and probably like 2 or 3 weeks later, I was there. I planned my own trip. That's just kind of the nature of my job at the time. So anyway, I remember I was only there for a few days, but then I was riding in a cab, and one of the things that I think is unique about a lot of cities over in Korea and Japan and other parts of Asia, everything's really compact. It's really different from here in the U.S. because here in the U.S. we're used to stuff being spread out, at least especially for me. I'm from Texas, so everything's spread out. There may be a couple of fields and then, a neighborhood and then more fields. It's like that where I live now in California as well. But in Asia, everything's just compact. So I was riding on a bus and, the cityscape just kind of hit me. I saw all these huge high-rise buildings and because obviously they don't have as much space over there as we do. So they tend to build up more than out. So I was seeing just all these buildings and I was like, man, there's a lot of construction going on over here. It looked like they were just putting up buildings left and right. So that got me thinking. I was like, it brought a question to my mind, like, why do we need to constantly build new buildings? Why are they always building new buildings? Now, this wasn't a Korea thing. This was like a worldwide thing, right? Because it's the same in, I've seen this in a bunch of places that I've traveled. I've seen it in Singapore, I've seen it in Japan, I've seen it in China, I've seen it here in the U.S., of course. Like new stuff is always going up. But I think it's a question that a lot of people don't really ask. Because I feel like we're so used to seeing new buildings go up that we don't really question why they're being built. We're just like, oh, of course, they're building a new neighborhood over there. Of course, they're building a new office building, a new mall, whatever. But I think it would seem weird for people to not see new stuff going up. And yeah, it just got me thinking, like, what's going on here? So my answer to this question would eventually lead me to the premise and one of the plot point for the novel, for Sirius and Limnic. So when I first started thinking about an answer to the question, why do we need to constantly build new buildings, just based on my random observation during one time in Korea, the first answer I came up with was the most obvious. It was that, well, obviously we have more people, so we need more places for them to live, work, and do stuff in. We need places for them to go shopping. We need places for them to hang out, when it's not pandemic times, of course. But yeah, I feel like this is like the most common answer that somebody, if you asked them just randomly on the street, they would probably give. There's more people. Chances are there's more people living in your town or city today than there were yesterday. That's just kind of how things work. So you always need to be building. And I would think that makes sense. You would think, okay, that's done. But for me, that didn't really get to the heart of the matter. Because I was like, if it's just based solely on population growth, in a lot of metropolitan areas in the U.S. and around the world, there's a lot of abandoned buildings. So how come we're not just repurposing a lot of this old stuff for, for more people. That was a thought that I came up with. Why don't we just fix these things up again, make them like new, and then people start living in them and living their lives in them. I feel like that's not usually the first answer you hear. The first answer is like, no, everybody would rather have a new building. So that's usually what happens first. But then that led me to a second thought and a second possible answer to the question, why we're always building. And I was like, well, in a typical capitalist economy, it requires just growth, constant growth. And whether that's finding new emerging markets, new technologies, new buildings, that's kind of a requirement. So even though it's been a while since my first economics course, the way I remember it is, you have this kind of score point system called the gross domestic product, the GDP. And I say score, but you know what I mean. It's like it's just kind of like the collection of all of a country's goods and services, what they make, use, produce. It goes toward the GDP. And you got to have a high GDP. It's got to keep growing year over year to have a good economy, at least on paper, right? So I think of that, when I'm thinking about economics of building new buildings, that makes sense. Like new buildings contribute towards GDP, and that makes the economy better. No big deal there. So most people probably know all of this, they don't really need the extra economics lesson. But even when I was thinking of economics, that didn't really satisfy what I was looking for with the answer, because I felt like, yeah, economics are important, but the more important part is people. People build buildings. People need buildings. So I feel like once I started thinking about us as people, then I was getting closer to my answer. I started thinking about human nature. And I know it's kind of a weird segue, but I have to tell you, this is the way my mind works as far as making connections and things. And I think this thought process really allowed me to write the novel, because I was able to kind of to connect different things that seemingly don't really have a connection. But then when I started diving deeper, they do. I want to talk real quick about immortality. I know it's kind of a random to go from why do we need to build more buildings and the economy to immortality, but I feel like our modern day economy would love it if we all of a sudden just snapped our fingers and became immortal today. I really do. I really feel like that would be the case, because I think about it this way. Dead people, or the dead, pay no taxes. They have no fear of getting sick, obviously, so they don't need insurance, so they don't pay into that. They're not collecting wages. They're not working, so obviously they're not going to spend. They have no disposable income to spend on leisure activities, for like buying clothes or going on vacation or buying a new house. They don't need credit or anything like that. So basically what my point is, after we die, we become useless as an economic unit. And while that may, I know that may sound cold, but that's the way it is. After we're kind of deceased, we're not a part of the economic machine anymore. So when I started thinking about immortality in the context of economics, I was like, it's not just not in the context of economics, in the context of building more buildings. It's not just building the building. The building, yes, it serves a purpose. You can live in it, you can work in it, you can hang out in it, whatever, you can visit. But the building is not the only thing. When I think about it kind of in the metaphorical sense, a building, it's a physical manifestation of something. And I think about, when I think of that something, I think about the human spirit, right? Because not only do we want to live, we would like to live forever, or they would like us to live forever in body, but we want to live forever. A lot of people want to live forever in mind, body, and spirit. This not only goes for buildings, but the things that we do and create. So when I create something, when I write a book, I expect it to basically live forever. You know, when I create something, when somebody puts up a building, how long do you want it to stay up? As long as possible. You know, I don't want it to get torn down because nobody wants to live in it anymore or use it anymore, or because some natural disaster came and blew it away or knocked it down, you know. So I feel like when we build a building, we imbue it with a kind of energy. You know, not just living energy, but I mean the building itself. It represents something. So obviously this goes, you know, when we think of like family keepsakes or something, when we think of, you know, I think of my dad, you know, my family's got over hundreds of vinyl records that he used to listen to all the time, and they just sit at home. And my older brother, he'd be real sentimental, and you don't want to get rid of him. I mean, I don't want to get rid of him either. I don't see a reason why. Who's going to listen to him, you know? I mean, I guess vinyl has its surges, and a lot of people like vinyl, but they like vinyl of like new music, right? Not like music from the 70s and 80s and things like that. That's what we got. But those things, they're kind of, it imbues an essence with these types of things, you know? And I feel like that essence lives on in buildings and places that we work. You know, when I was thinking about this, that's kind of the word that I arrived at after all the, you know, the thought about economics and population and the human spirit. That's the word I was like, that's it. That's the answer. Why do we need to constantly construct new buildings? I believe it's the essence that we secretly hope to preserve when we build and occupy new buildings. That's what we're trying to do. You know, we're trying to build a place for it. We build it because we want to fill spaces that we perceive a permanence in. Not just a permanence of like safety of being in the building. You know, that's kind of the base thought, but a permanence of self. We build because it's an outward expression of our need for growth and change. We build because we want to live forever, not only in our minds, but in the minds of the world, even if it's only a handful of people, you know. I think it was this thought process that after a while, you know, it got me to the original concept of Sirius and Limnic as organizations. Like, not just the title of the book. I know it's called Sirius and Limnic, but Sirius in organization and Limnic in organization. One of the organizations, Sirius, is focused on the creation and cultivation of the human spirit. The other is focused on the same thing, creation and cultivation, but by means of destruction. You know, I thought that would be an interesting premise for a novel. And it turns out I was right.
Subscribe or follow the Sirius and Limnic podcasts on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher. For more information about Sirius and Limnic, visit keithhayden.net and subscribe, or follow @KH_author on Twitter.